And since this queen on f3 is not doing anything great, so that's why here Kasparov decides to bring this queen back to d1, which also opens the path for the move f4. And now here black have multiple options to continue this game, like he can start pushing this b pawn, or maybe he can go for e6, maintaining the pawn structure. But instead here MVL decides to go for rook to c8, taking control over this c file and supporting this c pawn. And after that here Kasparov strikes with the move f4. And now it's better for black to just go for the move which is e6, because he can stop so that he can stop this push, stop this pawn from pushing further. But instead he goes for the move e5, and the problem with that move is now white can push this pawn further, which actually happens in the game, trying to attack this pawn chain of black. And as you can see, black now has this powerful triple pawn structure in the center, directly taking control over the board. And to tackle this, the move queen to f3 might be the better option for white, because first of all it attacks the d pawn, and secondly it supports the f pawn, which is sitting in a very strong position. And suppose if he defends by knight to e7, which looks a good move, but now comes c4, attacking this strong central pawn. And suppose if black pushed his pawn to d4, trying to attack this bishop, simply bishop to f2. And since now white is targeting this pawn on b7, so to defend this, suppose if he decides to push b5, knight to e4. And now you can see here white is creating multiple threats in this position, like f6, which is going to target this bishop and this knight. And suppose to tackle this, if knight to f6, now comes bishop to h4, a good move, creating more pressure over this knight. And if knight takes e4, now I think most of you will probably go for either queen takes e4 or maybe rook takes e4. But honestly, queen takes e4 doesn't really make any sense, because then you immediately lose control over this pawn. So and suppose if you capture this by rook takes e4, you might be hoping that in the next move white will place his rook on g4, thinking that it will control this g file and pressurize black. But you are wrong, because that move is actually gives black a chance to completely neutralize the attack with a simple pawn push f6. A great move which first of all blocks the diagonal of this bishop, and secondly the move like rook to g4 is not going to work. Yes, this pins this bishop, but now comes the move queen to d7, and if queen to g3, knight takes f5. And now I think you all understand what is going on. So that's why let's go back to our move, which is knight takes e4. Yeah, so that's why after this move it's better to capture with the pawn. This is because now I think most of you will worried about the d pawn, about this pawn push, since this path is now cleared. But honestly, it's not such a big threat for white. I mean, just imagine if game continues like f6, then takes, bishop takes b5, and now white is threatening to give a check. So suppose if he slides his king, simply bishop to c4, taking control over this diagonal. And in the next move white will bring this queen to this h5 position, and by this you can see this position will be completely winning for white. Okay, so in the actual game, after the move d5, here Kasparov missed this move, and instead he decides to push g4, which allows black to push the move which is e4. And the problem with that move is suppose if white decides to capture this pawn on e4 by d takes e4, and now instead of recapturing this pawn, which will activate this knight, so here black can push d4, which attacks this bishop. And after suppose takes, this bishop is attacked, so he has to go back d3. Okay, takes, knight at d goes to e5. Now black can develop his another knight, and suppose if bishop to c4, b5, attacking this bishop again, and now white is forced to bring this bishop to f1. But why? This is because so that he can so that he can stop this move knight to d3. But black is now going to bring this another knight to d4, and now just look at the position of these two central knights. They are literally dominating the entire white position, and by this you can clearly see this position is much better for black. Okay, so in the actual game, after the move e4, here Kasparov goes for bishop to f4, and again it's better for black to capture this pawn on d3. This is because suppose after bishop takes d3, so here he can simply push c4, targeting this bishop, and after bishop to c2, queen to b6 check, king to h1, queen takes b2, and now clearly you can see this position is better for black. But in the actual game, after the move which is bishop to f4, here MVL missed that move and he brings his knight to e5. Yes, he wants to create pressure over this d pawn, but now white can simply capture this pawn on e4 by d takes e4. Okay, so now white is attacking this bishop, but actually just sliding this bishop to h1 might be the better option for white, simply tucking the king away from this any danger. But so after that he decides to he simply slides his bishop to f8, and after that here Kasparov goes for queen to f3. And here he is asking for a queen exchange, but obviously black cannot allow it, because if queen comes off, white knight will immediately becomes active. So instead, the better move for black was to place this rook on d8, activating the this rook on d8, activating this rook after this queen gets traded. But in the actual game, instead he decides to go for c4, and the problem with that move is now white can continue this game by pushing e5, maintaining this solid pawn structure. And suppose if black is not careful and he slides his c rook on d8, queen takes d3, rook takes d3, knight takes c4, rook takes h3, knight to d6, targeting this rook, and this bishop b, and suppose after this so targeting this b7 and this rook. And suppose if he tries to defend his pawn by rook to b8, then in this position you might be shocked that here white can actually sacrifice his knight by knight takes f7. This is because after king takes f7, e6 check, king to e8, and finally bishop takes b8. Okay, so in the actual game, after the move c4, after c4, here Kasparov goes for queen takes d3. He decides to exchange the queens. But here bishop to d2 might be a better option so that he can stop this d pawn from pushing further. Okay, so in this position, it's better for white to bring this king to e3 so that he can attack this rook and this pawn. But instead, he goes for knight to g3. And the problem with that move is now black can bring this bishop to b4, which is targeting this rook. And suppose if rook to e3, rook to f4 check, rook to f3, rook takes f3, king takes f3, and finally d2. And now you can see black has this advanced pawn which will give a significant advantage to black in the future. Okay, so in the actual game, after the move knight to g3, here MVL decides to go for rook to d5. And guys, you might be shocked that in this position, here black can actually sacrifice his rook by rook takes e7. This is because after f takes e7 check, king takes e7, now this position is still equal despite of being a rook down because of this bishop and this passed pawn. And here black has two options to stop white connected pawns. Suppose these two pawns, yeah. And suppose if game continues like king to e3, if he tries to get closer to our pawn, simply d2. Rook to c4, attacking this bishop, simply bishop to a5. And now clearly you can see here no side can progress in this position, and yeah, that's equal for both. Okay, so in the actual game, after knight to e7, here MVL decides to go for rook to d4. And the problem with that move is now white is going to exchange this rook first. And after suppose rook gets exchanges, simply king to f3. And in the next move, you can see now no one can protect this d pawn, which is the only winning hope for black. But in the actual game, after the move rook to d4, he also missed that exchange, and instead Kasparov goes for king to f3, losing all of his advantage. And yeah, so basically now Kasparov is attacking this rook, and it's better for black to simply go back to d8, but instead he made a mistake by rook to d4, which allows Kasparov to go for rook to c1, and which attacks this bishop. If bishop to a5, h5, d2, rook to c8 check, rook to d8, rook takes d8 check, bishop takes d8, king to e2, and due to these four connected pawns, clearly you can see this position is completely winning for white. Okay, so in the actual game, after rook to d4, he goes for knight to f5, and yeah, Kasparov also missed that move. And here Kasparov decides to push e6, but guys, instead of e6, here g6 might be the better option for white, because if he takes, then takes, and since he is threatening to give a check, but simply takes, now comes e6. Rook to d6, targeting this e6 pawn, but instead of defending this pawn, here we can play this amazing move, knight to f5. And obviously you cannot capture this knight due to the move which is e7. And suppose if d2, e takes d8 equal to queen, rook takes d8, f7 check, king to e7, rook takes d8, king takes d8, and finally f8 equal to queen. And suppose, yeah, so let's go back to our move knight to f5, and suppose if black decides to capture our pawn, then simply knight to g7 check, and black has to lose his rook. Okay, so in the actual game, after the move e6, and in this position, MVL resigned, because we all know that after takes, yeah, that's all. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.